Okay, this is chapter 8, the first part, which is on joints. So joints are really easy to injure and they are difficult to heal. And so we'll look at some of those challenges on why they're like that. They're a really unique structure in the skeletal system. There's a lot of these videos embedded in this PowerPoint, and I would recommend watching them. They show you really cool views, like kind of 3D views of some of the joints. So definitely watch each of them. This one is a career connection. Okay, so joints are also called articulations, and it's where two bones meet, and they either hold the two bones together or they give mobility so that your two bones can move relative to each other. There's two ways to classify them. One way is through their structure, like what they look like structurally, and the three types are fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. And then we also classify them by their function, by what kind of movement they allow. So you have immovable, slightly movable, and freely movable joints. So synarthrosis is immovable. We'll look at those first. And then amphiarthrosis is slightly movable, and then diarthrosis are the freely movable, what you normally would think of as a joint. Okay, so bones have this dense, so first we're going to do fibrous joints, sorry. Bones have this dense fibrous connective tissue when you're looking at a fibrous joint. They don't have a joint cavity like synovial joints, and they are immovable, so the bones are not actually moving relative to each other. And there are three types of fibrous joints. They are sutures, syndesmoses, and gomphoses. Okay, so sutures we've already seen in chapter 7, and this is in your skull. So these connect the bones of your skull together. They look like this. They're like interlocking. Where am I? And so the joints are in between that. And they start out more cartilaginous when you're young. When you're a baby, they allow for the skull to shift during birth. And then they ossify when you get older and turn into immovable joints that protect your skull. So there's your fibrous joint. If you zoom in, those are your sutures. And when you're an adult, they are more ossified. Syndesmoses are connected by ligaments. So ligaments are structures that are made out of cartilage, and they have low blood flow, so they're really hard to heal. You can have short fibers, or you can have longer fibers. The short ones don't provide very much movement, and the longer ones do. So here's a ligament connecting bone to bone, and they just kind of help support and keep those bones together, but they can be longer or shorter depending on what they need. And then gomphoses are peg and socket joints, like in your teeth. So if you've ever had a tooth pulled, the dentist has to wiggle and break that joint in order to pull the tooth out, and that's called a periodontal ligament. So there they are. That's your joint. That's another type of joint there, and it is immovable, and it's fibrous until you lose your tooth. Okay, then cartilaginous joints have cartilage. They don't have a joint cavity. They're medium movability, so they're not immovable, but they're not highly movable. And there's two types, synchondroses and symphyses. Okay, so synchondroses are bars or plates of hyaline cartilage that unite cells. They are almost always immovable. So an example, like you have a temporary epiphyseal plate joint, or the cartilage on the first rib with the manubrium of the sternum, so that top part of the sternum and your first rib. So here is that epiphyseal plate, that growth plate, right, that we saw in the last chapter. And then you have this joint right here too. So they're not really movable. They're maybe slightly movable, but really don't move very much. And then symphyses, we also saw in the last chapter. The pubic symphysis is the one that I pointed out, and this unites your bones there in your pelvis and also your intervertebral joints. So here is the pubic symphysis right there, and that's a joint, and then also these discs in between your vertebrae. So we've seen both of those already. Synovial joints are what you normally would think of as a joint. So these are like your freely movable joints. They have a joint-filled cavity with fluid in them, and they're on almost all of your limbs, so they help to move your limbs. They have 6 general features. They have bursae, which you might have heard of bursitis when you get pain in your joints and inflammation in your bursae. And then they have tendon sheaths. They have 3 factors that influence stability. And there's 6 different types that you've probably heard of. You probably have learned this before. So here's the 6 general characteristics. They have articular cartilage. That's the cartilage that covers the ends of the bone. So think of eating like a chicken and you've seen that cartilage on the end of the leg bone. That keeps the bone protected. So it prevents it from getting crushed. Then you have the joint cavity. That's the synovial part. So that's what makes it called synovial, is that cavity. That's a small fluid-filled space, and only synovial joints have that. And then you have the joint capsule. It's also called the articular capsule. 2 layers thick. You've got a fibrous layer and a synovial layer. So you've got a really dense layer and then a loose layer. That's where the synovial fluid is made. And synovial fluid is unique, obviously, to synovial joints. That is viscous, which means it's really thick, like syrup, thicker than syrup. And it's really slippery, so it like lubricates the joint. And it also removes microbes and debris. And then you have reinforcing ligaments too. So you have capsular ligaments, extracapsular, and intracapsular. Then finally you have nerves and blood vessels. So the nerves detect pain. So if you've ever hurt a joint, it's very painful. And then you have capillary bloods that supply synovial fluid, but there's not a lot of blood flow to these. So that's why joints have such a difficult time healing. Okay, so here are your different parts. You've got the ligament here on the outside, and that connects bone to bone. Here's your joint cavity, and then you have articular cartilage there. The fibrous layer is here, and then you have the synovial membrane. Together that makes the articular capsule. And then this is just periosteum. That's the covering of the bone there. So those are your general parts to synovial joints. There's some other things they can have. Some of them have fatty pads between the fibrous layer and the synovial layer for extra cushioning, like extra impact. And then some of them have menisci, like in your knee, and that is a separate surface on the end of the bone that protects the bone. Okay, so then bursae and tendon sheaths, these little bags, the little cavity with synovial fluid in it, it's like a ball bearing if you've learned about ball bearings or seen them before. So the little balls can spin freely and they're lubricated. So the bursae have fluid in them, and they reduce the friction of the ligaments and everything else, so it doesn't rub together, but it can become irritated and inflamed. And then you have tendon sheaths, and that's where the bursae are elongated and they wrap around the tendons. So let's see here. Here's a bursa right here, and that's filled with fluid. And then this right here is a tendon sheath that is encasing the tendon. So right there's the tendon. Tendons connect bones to muscle, and so this sheath is just protecting it. And then here's a synovial membrane. So, and there's your joint cavity with fluid. So these are like extra protectors, right? They can all become injured and inflamed though. So they do help your joints work better, but they're vulnerable. And that was a shoulder there. Here's a zoom in of the bursa. So that's what it looks like. It's a really thickened structure, has fluid that's really viscous, decreases friction, allows this tendon to not damage this joint, right? Okay, so I said that there were 3 factors influencing the stability of synovial joints. So the shape of the articular cartilage is important, like the shape of the ball and socket surfaces. So you've heard of those ball and socket joints. The ligament number and location. Ligaments kind of secure everything and keep everything kind of in place. And then muscle tone. So your body's built like your muscles are supposed to be able to support all of these and keep your bones moving correctly. Like that depends on your muscles. So if your muscles are not in shape, you're going to put undue stress on some of these other structures. Okay, so let me see. I can't see this small thing here. These are like your different types of joints, so you need to carefully look at this picture and know some of these types of joints. The structural types are listed here. So I see fibrous in the skull, synovial in the temporal bone, and mandible where that articulates, where your mandible mouth opens, your jaw opens. Synovial here in the occipital bone, so moving your neck. Synovial there in your atlas and your axis. Remember your cervical 1 and 2 vertebrae. There's a cartilaginous symphysis one there. Then you've got in your intervertebral discs are synovial, costovertebral discs and sternoclavicular are all synovial, and then you move on down. So look carefully through this. And when it's a good idea when you're studying anything in human anatomy, but especially like muscles and bones, when you're looking at each of these, I want you to look at it on your own body and articulate those joints. And so you're connecting it to your own body, and it kind of serves as like a marker to remember it. And then the next slide we have are some other joints. It has them named, and then the types too. You're going to have way more synovial joints in the lower body than the upper body. Okay, so in order to move your joints, you need muscles, and we'll learn about muscles in a later chapter, but muscles are attached to bone, and they're usually attached to 2 different bones, like one, if they're anchored to one and then they're pulling on another, but not always. But there's usually 2 points that they're attached to, and those 2 points are called the origin and the insertion. And so the origin is the bone that the muscle is anchored to, and then the insertion is the bone that muscle is attached to move. Like that's the bone that it's actually moving. So think of your bicep here. Your bicep is attached to your humerus. So that would be the origin. That's the immovable bone. And then it's moving your ulna and radius up. So those are the movable bones. So you can see the difference there. So there's lots of different ranges of motions with bones, and some of these, like I definitely want you guys to try these because you'll remember more if you actually do them. So there's different types of movement and range of motion. Non-axial is slipping movements. Uniaxial is moving on one plane. That word makes sense. Biaxial is 2 planes. Multi-axial is all 3 planes, like X, Y, Z, all 3 directions. And then the 3 general types of movements are gliding, angular, and rotation. So gliding movements happen like in your hand, your intercarpal and intertarsal joints. Those are gliding, where the bones are gliding over one another, and also in your vertebrae. So here's that gliding movement. You can kind of move your hand back and forth, and those joints are gliding. So try that, like on all of these, seriously try it and see what it feels like. Okay, angular movements are changing the angle in between the bones, and you can measure the angle and range of motion and see if you have like healthy normal range of motion. So there's 2 types. You probably have heard of this: flexion and extension. So flexion decreases the angle and extension increases the angle. So try that with your arm and leg and look at what the difference is between flexion and extension, or your feet or whatever. Hyperextension is when you extend too far beyond that that normal angle, and that usually results in injury. So there's extension and flexion, and then hyperextension would be too far. And then that's extension and flexion of the vertebral column, and then hyperextension. So try those. Get up and try them. It's good. It's good. It's a good way to learn, and you'll remember it better. And then here is showing flexion and extension of the legs and arms, and then hyperextension. Okay, then there's other angular movements too. There's abduction and adduction, and then circumduction. So abduction and adduction are opposites, and the words look really similar. And here's how I remember what abduction means, and then I just automatically remember adduction. With abduction, I think of being abducted by aliens, and so you're moving away from the midline. So like if you move your arm away from your midline, that's abduction. So think of being abducted by aliens. And then adduction is moving back towards the midline. And you have muscles like leg muscles named for these two words. And so like, for example, when you're riding a horse, you're using your adductors because you're squeezing, or am I squeezing the horse with your muscles? And so those are called the adductors, and you're pulling in. And then when you're lifting your leg up, you're doing abduction, right? And then circumduction, the limb is moving like in a circle, so you're doing flexion, abduction, extension, and adduction all. So there is abduction, you're getting abducted by aliens. Adduction is the opposite, moving back down, and then circumduction is like moving in a circle. Makes sense. Rotation is different from circumduction. So rotation is like moving around an axis, like around a central line. So you have medial and lateral. So medial is moving towards the midline, lateral is moving away from the midline. So that's showing rotation. And so if you're moving your head back to the center, that's medial, away from the center is lateral. Okay, then there's some other special, some joints do some special movements. So one is called supination and pronation. I want you to try this. This is rotation of your radius and ulna. Where am I? Like this. So supination is where your palms face anteriorly, so towards the front. Your radius and ulna are parallel. And then pronation is your palm faces posteriorly and your radius rotates over your ulna. You can also do it with your legs. So there's dorsiflexion and plantar flexion of the foot. So dorsiflexion is bending your foot towards the shin, and then plantar flexion is pointing your toes like a ballerina. So there is pronation and supination. So try that. You can see how supination, the bones are parallel, and then pronation, radius rotates over the ulna. Try that out and see what your arm bones do. And then there's dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So try that out too. Okay, then you also have some other special movements like inversion and eversion. So inversion, the sole of the foot faces medially towards the inside, and then eversion is it faces laterally. So I'll show you a picture in a second. And then protraction and retraction, like in your mandible, you can do protraction where your mandible juts out, and then retraction, the mandible is pulled in. Those are hard to do for some people. So there's inversion and eversion, try that out. And then protraction and retraction of the mandible. So those are some other special movements that some body parts can do. Here's some others: elevation and depression of the mandible. So elevation means lifting a body part up, and depression means lowering it, like lowering your jaw. And then opposition is how your thumb can move, because we have opposable thumbs. So it allows us to grasp things. So there's elevation and depression, and then opposition can move up and down. Okay, so these are the different terms. So this would be a good slide to take notes from, and then try these movements, like just looking at the names to see if you remember them. Okay, here are the 6 types of synovial joints. I'm pretty sure you've learned some of these in school, I hope. So there might be different names for them, like you might have seen different names, but these are like pretty universal. So you have plain, hinge, pivot, condylar, saddle, and ball and socket. Okay, so the first one is a plain joint. These are the gliding ones. We already talked about the gliding motion, and so these are in your wrist and your ankle, so your carpals and tarsals. And these joints just slide as you're moving your hand or your foot, they're just gliding. And then you have a hinge joint, so you can think of like a hinge in your cabinets. There's like a trough and a cylinder, just like a hinge, and it moves like this, like kind of a, not twisting, but rotating motion. And then you have the pivot joint. So pivoting is rotating in a vertical axis. And so this is how your radius and ulna work. So you've got your your bone here, and then it's rotating in that axle. So just like a wheel in an axle. Condylar joints are kind of, there's like a cup surface, and then it's not a ball and socket joint, but it's kind of similar, and that it fits right into that little cup shape. And so these are your knuckle and wrist joints. And so you can see they just have that like kind of domey shape. And then a saddle joint is, this is how I usually like kind of show a saddle joint. And it looks like you're sitting on a saddle, or how a saddle is on a horse. So these are in your hand also, and they're able to slide back and forth like this. And there's some movement this way too. So you can do abduction and adduction and flexion and extension. And then the famous ball and socket joints. So you've got two sets of these, your scapula and your humerus, and then your femur with your pelvis. And so they're similar to the condylar ones, but you have a full ball, and then you have the socket, and they're very movable joints. Like they have a large range of motion because of the shape. And that's all for that section.